a Swedish perspective on innovation in mining and mining equipment, and are there any possibilities of links between the two large and important mining countries? South Africa in the African continent on the very tip, Sweden in Europe on the very tip, but still an important mining country. So I hope for an informal discussion after an introduction by May and Henrik, where we can discuss practicalities. So how can we support links between Sweden and Africa? The reason I'm a bit focused on that is not only a long history in Africa, but also that I've been part of the Academy's Africa Council. We have been working for about a year trying to find ways for the Academy to engage more in Africa and promote Swedish, African, not only South African, cooperation in research, business, and in general. So that's the background. And let me then introduce May Hermanus. She's the Executive Director of the Natural Resources and Environment Division of Unit of Council for Scientific Industrial Research, CSIR, which is a partly government-funded and partly by project funding organization in South Africa, based in Pretoria, but having its mining unit right now reinstated in Johannesburg. It's, I would say, one of the largest, perhaps the largest applied researcher organization in Africa. So welcome, May. The floor is yours, so to say. I think if you do something 20 minutes, Henrik, 10, 15 minutes, and then we have half an hour or something like that for discussion.
Thanks very much. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak to you. And I'm going to basically pilfer some of the slides that I'm going to present at your mind, but I'm not intending to do a very formal presentation because I think I need to speak around some of the topics that I'm going to be presenting at your mind. But let me start off by just talking a little bit about the CSIR and its role in respect of mining and mining technology. And then I'll take you to a slide where I've summarized some of the challenges facing the mining industry in South Africa specifically, and then some of the thoughts about how to address some of those problems and the difficulties we face in acting on those resolutions. And I think that there may be interest here in this room at Euromine and in Sweden on looking at how one can resolve some of the problems that we have to deal with in South Africa. But let's start with the CSIR. As Magnus indicated, it's the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. It has about 2,000 people working at the CSIR, of which the majority are scientists and engineers. The Council's mandate is to ensure that science and technology are directed to developing the economy. So we're needing to get to the point where we can transfer technology into business. We're often involved with startups with new businesses, but we also deal with the science questions that cannot be resolved by business, but require a specific scientific endeavor. So, for example, the unit that I'm responsible for, which is the Natural Resources and Environmental Unit, and that's why mining is associated with that unit, deals with a very, very wide scope of things, many of which appear to be unconnected to mining, but in fact they are connected to mining as they are to most of the industrial sectors. So, for example, if I start through our portfolio of work, the first thing that we look at is the issue of climate change, which is a massive issue in South Africa, given that we're likely to experience double the temperature increases that are expected across the world in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you're looking at a 4-degree rise in temperature globally, that translates, 2 degrees globally, that translates into 4 degrees in South Africa, which is already an arid country, water-short country, and also a country where there's very little arable land. So that, I think, has a bearing on all industries, but particularly mining, because mining ultimately is an industry that involves disturbance of land, and it's also quite water demanding. So climate change is the first bit of work that we do, and a lot of our research is actually done in the Southern Ocean. So we're involved with the Antarctica work, and we have within the unit, together with the Department of Environmental Affairs, a ship where we essentially monitor conditions out in the Southern Ocean and put together the aspects of the global climate change model that is discussed, that has been discussed in Paris. And we have a chapter of that model going into that shortly. The next part we deal with is ecosystem services, which is looking at how one brings into balance a range of activities in the same land space. And so, for example, it's in that space that we're starting our discussions on how mining interfaces with other industries, how it interfaces with water, how it interfaces with agriculture, and so on. The whole idea here is to understand the trade-offs and the risks associated with land use, and to look at an optimum use of land. The next part of the unit, I have 200 scientists working in the unit full-time as possible. In the next part of the unit, we have a water resources group, and they look at water quality and water quantity. So they're involved in trying to map our entire water resource space and to look at all of the activities and impact on water quality. And as you can imagine, mining is part of that, particularly coal mining and gold mining. We also have very significant problems. Does anyone need me to use the mic? You do. I see a couple of nods, so I'll use the mic. So we have a situation where we're needing to look at the relationship between industry and other human activities and the ecosystem services that we desperately need. And for us, the key ones are trying to preserve our arable land and trying to ensure that we have good water quality. And as I was saying, the water group maps out our water resource space. We don't yet have enough information about our groundwater and the movement of our groundwater. And given the issues around shale gas in South Africa, there's a big initiative to look for shale gas in a section of the country called the Karoo. The connection between groundwater and the possibility of fracking is something that is at the moment receiving a great deal of attention. If we look at gold mining, our gold mines are very deep, and they are situated in areas where we have an underground karst environment, underground big compartments with water. Many of them were pumped dry in order to allow mining to take place. And now as mines close, the water is rising, the water levels are rising, but they're becoming contaminated through interaction with the mine working. So we have a huge problem with acid mine drainage and heavy metals in the water. And so the problem is similar but not the same as gold mining, because the acid mine drainage coming off our gold mines is very different to what we have in the coal mines. So that gives you an idea of how our water group interfaces with the mining sector. Then the last group we have is our green economy group. And what they do is they're looking at transitions to a much more sustainable way of working in all of industry. So it's not just mining, but everything else. It's a very broad agenda, and at the moment, a lot of the work there is focused on issues of policy. What pricing changes do we need in the economy to get, for example, much more efficient energy use, to get much more efficient water use? And in our case, we have to start with just understanding who all the water users are and how much water they use. And given the approach in the past, this is proving to be quite a significant challenge in and of itself. And the green economy group are also looking at ways. They have some technology sections in that group. So we have a biotechnology initiative in that group, which is built around biorefining. Essentially, it was started on the back of problems in the forestry sector, because obviously paper has largely is disappearing. The use of paper has declined very significantly, and South Africa, one of our significant users of forestry products, were not only mines in terms of the support that goes into mines, the timber support that goes into mines, but also the pulp and paper industry. So at the moment, the biorefinery is about looking at different ways to use wood products and to turn it into inputs that can go into the chemical industry or any other industries that might use them. So obviously that lends itself then to think about what can be done in respect of mining land. So for example, if we look at mining land in South Africa, we have an extraordinary number of abandoned mines. The last count was about 6,000 of them, some very large, some very small. They're often concentrated in particular areas because our ore bodies tend to be massive. So there's a concentration of mines, so the concentration of their effects is very significant. So we're right at the beginning of thinking about, can we think about this abandoned land differently? Can we think about it in combination with our water technology, with our biorefinery technology, with the idea that we can try and restore that land if we can treat the water on site, perhaps use renewable energy of some kind for both water treatment and to provide perhaps excess energy into settlements and towns around these mines. We can think about a very different future, but that's quite an expensive undertaking, as you know. But given that all of the mining companies have a budget for what we call rehabilitation, there is an opportunity here to just rethink the whole idea of what happens post-mine closure. And we've started some work on that. So that just gives you, I think, a picture then of the work that I do in the natural resources space. And mining fits in because it is obviously a natural resource. But unlike many of the other aspects I've talked about, it has a very strong industrial component to it. Like, I suppose the only other parallel I can draw is that the biorefinery space is certainly a space of industry rather than natural science, but even though it comes off a natural resource space. The reason why the mining group is with me is, I think, part of the I think is illustrative of the problems that we're facing. The reason is that this particular group has now become extremely small. At one point in the country, we had about 800 scientists and engineers working on mining problems. Deep level mining, in particular, needed the solution of these very deep shafts. It needed solutions that allow us to ventilate mines that are vast underground, and it needed solutions in how you transport people. Given the numbers of people working on these mines, there were solutions required around their health and safety, nutrition, and so on. And we haven't done that well, which leads us to some of the problems. The people issues we haven't done well, which leads to some of the problems that we now face today in this massive transition that's required in gold and platinum mining in particular. But all of that was enabled by a group, as I say, of over 800 scientists working on mining. We are now down to about 60 scientists who are actively working on mining problems, and that is spread across a number of institutions. The CSIR as the largest group, then we have some people at the University of the Witwatersrand, which is in Johannesburg, and some people at the University of Pretoria. So we're at the point where we're asking ourselves, how do we rebuild our R&D capacity? How do we rebuild it in such a way that we address the fundamental problems in South Africa, and who do we partner with in doing so? So I'm now going to go to one of my slides, which I think just picks up on that and where I've just stopped. What I tried to do in my presentation, I think is just worth mentioning here, is that globally, I understand, and you may or may not share that view, that there is a need for innovation in the sector. And it really is linked to a range of global factors. One related to our understanding of this commodity cycle that we're in. Two, the economics of mining itself, which is very capital intensive and is out of step with the kind of shifts that you can literally see overnight in that market. And then the issue of mining and society. And in South Africa, the mining and society issues are the most significant ones. I don't want to spend too much time on that, so I'm going to go directly to the South African problems. Yeah. Okay. Now, if one looks at South African mines, we have a very large sector, and we have a very large number of commodities being mined in South Africa. The industrial minerals are iron ore, and we also have a significant industry mining coal. Now, obviously, you're aware that the bottom's fallen out of the iron ore markets, and in coal, we have this huge question around, do we mine fossil fuels? But in the country, we have a 90% dependence on coal as our primary industry or primary source of energy. Compounding that is the fact that our current coal field is closing down. It's reaching the end of its life. And if we are going to be mining coal, we need to open up new coal fields, and they need to be opened up in an area which is environmentally sensitive. And it also is, the coals there are even harder than the coals and more silicaceous than the coals that we have at the moment. Our coals have always been hard. We've had horrific accidents, disasters in our coal mining industry, which would appear in the 1980s. These graphs are not sufficiently granular for you to see that, but I personally was involved in some of these investigations where up to 68, 70 people die in a single coal dust explosion underground. And that's been resolved through science, and some of that science came from the CSIR on how one controls coal dust explosions in South African mines. Peculiar situation there related to the nature of the ore body and also the mixture of flammable gas. So I think the first thing to note about our mines is that they are largely labor intensive. And that has changed over here. So the coal mines, our iron ore mines have all become mechanized. And if people come from other parts of the world where the industry is mechanized, they would recognize the kind of mining that is done in that area and the equipment that is used in those spaces. A lot of that, as I say, has come through trial and error, and some of that trial and error has had disastrous impacts for miners and mining communities. Our gold and platinum mines, on the other hand, remain labor intensive. And what we have essentially are massive ore bodies, narrow reefs. In some of the platinum spaces, it is possible to put big equipment into those spaces, but largely they're narrow reef. And what that means is that miners are directly exposed to hazards at the working face. And that has been a continuous problem in the South African industry. Our inspectorate has been very active on reducing risk in the mines, and the response has been to reduce exposure. And in South Africa, given that we do not have the technical solutions, it's actually meant that the number of operating phases have declined over time. So let's just have a look then at gold mining. So at the moment, we have of our gold mining, what we call current conventional mining is exactly this labor-intensive mining, where the people who go underground, who drill, there's blasting, people have to retreat from the working face, and about 54% of that is 54% of our gold resources are being mined in that way. We have some remnants and pillars that are being mined, and there's some very small percentage of mechanized mines. But you can see here a big problem that a lot of this mining, our gold can no longer be mined in this way. The ultra-deep gold, low-grade gold, and the gold that is unminable because of the working conditions or the mining conditions. And then our conventional mining itself is at risk, simply because we cannot continue with the labor-intensive mining that we do. It places people under too much risk. So we have 600 million tons of gold left to be mined, and we estimate that 42% of it will not be mineable unless we have a massive change in technology. This is just an indication of the number of abandoned mines in the country, and you can see that they are concentrated in the northeastern part where the gold and platinum mines, coal, and on the eastern sides where the coal mines are. And that's really when I talk about ecosystem services and trade-offs, that's really what we're dealing with. In terms of platinum, we know that at the moment, if we're looking at conventional mining, that our mines, the current mines, would be mined out by 2029, and if we extended their lives through some form of mechanization, current mines would run out at 2035. So, but we have massive platinum resources. But again, like gold mining, we've run out of technology that can effectively address the problems in mining. And given that, we now have a process underway to try and look at the future from the perspective of how do we address all of the underlying problems and start to tease out what do we do next. Now, we've had a significant national process called the Pakisa, which brought many institutions together of government, people from the mining companies themselves, equipment manufacturers, and also some of the stakeholders to resolve these problems. And at the moment, there's a great deal of work going on in trying to define the different roles of the different stakeholders. Now, these were the key things that came out of this. The one is to revive investment in mining, and that has to do with the policy uncertainty that we've seen in South Africa. And I don't really have time to go into that today, but underlying South Africa's issues are the fact that is our history of excluding black South Africans from participating in the heart of the economy. So at the same time dealing with all of these problems, there's thinking about how do we make sure that we have a more inclusive society, how do we ensure that that South Africans who were marginalized in the past are operating in the heart of our economy. So we have to both, and that costs money, and those transitions are difficult, and that has led to quite a great deal of uncertainty around investment. So we're needing to think about how do we do that. The next is around mining cluster employment. South African gold mines and platinum mines, in fact, all of mining rests on migrant labor. Workers come from the rural parts of the country, and as employment declines in the mining sector, those communities are stranded. Also, we have very large now informal settlements around mines, and so the areas around mines in themselves have become very, very unstable because of the lack of services and the massive miners who live there together with others who are seeking employment on the mines. So the issue of mechanization or automation is compounded by the fact that we need to improve our employment prospects. That all leads to the issues of sustainable communities, and I've already mentioned some of the issues around sustainability that go beyond mining, water, arable land, and so on. You can imagine with such a large numbers of people who are outside of the formal economy, many people live directly off the land and obtain their livelihoods from the land itself. So we're needing to think about how do we make communities and mining communities sustainable. One of the issues, I think, for ourselves and for everybody on the continent is the question of beneficiation. Much of our mineral resources are exported. Can we beneficiate at home? Can we create local markets? That lends itself again to the industrialization discussion that goes beyond mining itself. And the last issue, which is called advancing the cluster, is really about how do we take the thoughts around the technical changes that need to be made in the cluster forward, together with the involvement of mining companies, government, organizations like ourselves, the universities, as well as stakeholders like the trade unions. Very important, again, in South Africa, and they play a very important political role in the country. So you can see that brings the tension around working and living conditions and employment right into the heart of this. Thanks, Magnus. So I'm basically going to then just go to the slide where I've summarized what it is that we're trying to do. We're needing to try and improve our extraction rates in mining, which means how do we change the picture where we have people working for mining for 6 hours a day, basically. That's effectively what our drill, blast, and clean cycle leaves us with. Can we localize the technologies that we use both currently for our conventional mining? It would save costs. The rand is very much depressed against the euro and the dollar. Can we improve local capacity and local skills, and how do we do that? Can we make use of what we call adjacent technologies that allow us to optimize the use of equipment? These are the sensors and other types of devices that allow us to understand the condition of equipment and have much more optimal maintenance and much more optimal management and use of equipment in mines. Then the next issue, which is central to the gold and platinum mining, is about transforming the mining sector. Can we customize? Can we develop customized mechanized equipment that allow us to get into these very narrow reefs? And when I'm talking about narrow, they're much less than a low-profile equipment here, where 2 meters in South Africa is not considered low profile. We're really talking at about half of that, at 1 meter. Do we have effective cutting tools to cut the rock? I understand at the moment we're at the limit of sort of rock cutting at about 140 MPa, but we need to go to about 200 MPa to cut our gold mining ore, our gold mine reef. Can we get equipment that operates on steeper slopes? We might have massive ore bodies, but they're not necessarily flat, they're faulted, and the areas where we have very, very steep slopes, can equipment be designed that can actually operate on these slopes? Do we have the tires? Do we have the stability that's required there? And then lastly, given the fact that we at this very point having to rethink where we go with coal mining, how do we make sure that we have reliable energy sources and preferably renewable? And that brings me back then to where I started with the green economy and some of the work that we're doing in that space. So I'm going to leave that there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, May. I suggest that you keep your questions in your minds, and we ask Henrik to come upstage directly. Henrik, as I mentioned, he's president of Rock Tools within Sandvik. He also has a long background in the mining sector, working for McKinsey for many years, and some of those years actually in South Africa. And so please, Henrik, you go ahead and we can sit down.
I can sit down, thank you.
Right, this always works. At least some of it. Yeah. All right, I will be very brief. It's early in the morning, and so we can get some questions and discussions. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm actually not president of Rock Tools just yet. I'm only.
It's only a matter of time.
It'll happen on July 1st, yeah. So now I'm responsible actually for global equipment in Sandvik mining. We're changing to Sandvik mining and rock technology. But it's the same equipment as we've had all along. No big change. We talked a little bit about safety here in the room. Safety is a key topic. You brought it up, May. It's safe mines tend to be productive mines. So working with safety is also a good way to work with productivity. The way that governments has also made safety a top priority for mining is if you have an accident or you have a fatality, it's very costly. You shut the mine down, you do investigations for a very long time, and while that is a maybe more transactional way of looking at something that's very tragic, it's very effective. So the worst thing you can have in a mine is an accident. We worked with it in Sandvik. We measure something called lost time injury frequency rate. So what's the frequency of having an accident where somebody gets hurt so they actually can't go to work? When we started this a little over 10 years ago, we were at above 20 of these accidents per million hours worked. We're now at about 1. So you can make a lot of progress on this. This is within Sandvik. The mining industry has made similar progress over the last 20 years, I would say. But this is top priority. So it took me a bit of time. In the beginning, I thought it was an invasion of privacy when people started talking about how I get to work and do I actually stop at a red light. But I've learned to accept that this is critically important. It's where we start all the time. Sandvik, very quickly, we're moving to 3 business areas in Sandvik. This is about 85 billion SEK, or I guess that's about 150 billion rands, or 9 to 10 billion euros. Mining is about equal with the machining solutions business area. So mining and rock technology account for about 30% of that. We then look at where we're active. We're active in underground hard rock, in surface drilling and comminution. That's crushing rock in crushers or mills. Demolition and recycling and oil and gas are obviously not mining. We're in soft rock mining. Soft rock, that's coal and potash and salt, but for all intents and purposes, it's coal. In South Africa, it's a big market for us. We're in tunneling, which is just tunnels for a different purpose than mining for cars and trains, and then in exploration. Currently, about a third of our sales is in equipment. The rest is in aftermarket. The aftermarket, that's spares and wares, including rock tools. A rock tool is essentially it's drill bits and drill steel, and the picks that you see when you're mining coal, you put picks at the end, and you actually then do the mechanical cutting of coal. And we're working on solutions to do that also in much harder rock, which May was referring to. If you look a little bit at our exposure to these and how we're doing, underground hard rock is our sweet spot. And that's where we do most of our business. So this is an indication of the size of business that we have in each. But in South Africa and Southern Africa, it's very particular kind of underground hard rock mining. There are some very big mass mining operations, but most of it is narrow reef. And that's very specific to Southern Africa. And narrow reef, you need special equipment to go down to the 1.2 meters or 0.8 meters, and having equipment that can work in that environment. And the reason you want to go down to that level, because if you can't, and the ore body is 0.8 meters, we have to mine a bunch of rock that we don't need. And that takes a lot of energy and takes a lot of cost that you don't want to spend, because you're mining rock that's worthless. On to Southern Africa. So we're organized into sales areas, and Southern Africa is one of them, where we have 51 operating sites, of which 47 are in South Africa. So South Africa is very, very important for Sandvik. It's one of our top 2 or 3 markets, depending. Currently, it's probably, with the rand being where it is, and platinum mining being where it is, currently probably number 3 for us. Just a little bit of an indication of the amount of people that we have. 1,500 in South Africa, employed by Sandvik, and obviously a lot of extra externals, also paid by Sandvik but not employed by Sandvik. We talked a little bit about corporate social responsibility, and so if I just take what's on the slide first and then take a little bit step back, but we think that engaging in the South African economy and fostering the transition or supporting the transition of the South African economy is very important for us. It's a way to be not just be responsible, but to be a contributing player in South Africa. It's the only way. And having lived there for a few years, I have a lot of respect for that. Now, we break it down in both in the it's easier when it was called BEE, but now it's triple B, double E, essentially the same thing as I understand it, but really engaging all members of the community in the economy, being that blacks, coloreds, female workers, more in mining. We need a lot more women in mining, make it also a lot more fun to work there. We're committed to investing in both of these categories, and we really look for co-investing with our partners, with our customers and suppliers, and our industry peers, but also with government. And this is a way for us to make these investments a little less risky. We have, so speaking of low profile and narrow reef mining, we have a lot of really exciting R&D proposals for narrow reef. Because developing these pieces of equipment take quite a bit of time and effort. And we need to prioritize those investments versus investing in block caving and so on. But having automated mines, having fuel cell powered equipment underground, which is very relevant in South Africa, is very possible. We're currently actually doing one of these investments, or take a sidetrack, talk about that with Anglo. We're developing a fuel cell powered loader together with Anglo together with Anglo Platinum for mining, and Anglo's invested in fuel cell technology. Fuel cells are great when they're working. The biggest problem is really getting liquid nitrogen down underground in a safe way, so you don't have an explosion. Anglo's invested a lot in that, and we're building this loader together with them. And that's one such investment. But we have others that we want to do, and then it's a prioritization between narrow reef versus other mining methodologies. And here's where, and also we do most of these investments in R&D in Europe. There's no reason why we couldn't do them in South Africa. But then again, if we can lower the risk of putting these R&D resources in South Africa, it makes it a lot easier decision for us. The same for manufacturing capability in South Africa, which we have some, primarily for rebuilding equipment as opposed to making it from scratch. So that's a little quick overview of Sandvik in South Africa, and a little bit how we think about these investments. Very, very committed to making them, but the economics have to make sense.
Thank you, Henrik. So, may you please come up here, and we can have start the second part of our morning here. I think that's where you left off, Henrik, is very interesting. And while you are thinking about your questions, why not start off with that? You said lower the risks. Which are those risks?
Well, essentially is that we develop equipment that nobody buys.
Yeah.
It's not much more difficult than that. Or that we create capacity to build equipment that then nobody buys.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you have any comments on that, May?
I think that is a very significant concern. In South Africa, we know that our gold and platinum particularly is characterized by these very narrow reefs. And one of our immediate tasks is to look at what would be a global market for this this type of equipment? You know, where else are there narrow reefs? We know that at the moment there's a focus on surface mining. Those ore bodies are a lot easier to access, but at some point we're going to have to go underground and do the difficult stuff. And I think that part of this is developing not only a case for South Africa, which we think we have, but in fact a case globally.
Deborah?
This is a question to Henrik. I'm involved in International Women in Mining, so I loved the shout out, Women in Mining. I just read a research report that said that, you know, in South Africa, they're trying to get more women working in underground mining. They often struggle physically to meet the demands of the job. And I was wondering if, when you're designing equipment, if there's any consideration for women being able to operate the equipment. I know this has been discussed in women in mining groups across Africa for some time, that the equipment is not adjusted for women's use.
Actually, the first time I hear that that's an issue.
Okay.
I've never heard that it's an issue. What I have heard is that there are two steps to making your equipment last longer. The second, more extreme step is to have a computer run the equipment that's fully automated and autonomous. Then it'll last a lot longer. But a really good first step is to get a woman to drive it. Because then it'll last a lot longer than when the man drives it.
Yeah, I've heard that with trucks and operating that type of equipment, but like heavy drills, things like that.
And we don't make any handheld drills.
Okay.
We only make drills that are mounted on a piece of equipment that you drive, and we don't have that issue. And that's also, we talk about mechanization. Mechanization is really going away from handheld drills to unfair to call it proper equipment, but more sturdy, real equipment underground, and get away from handheld drills, which require a lot of muscle and is very dangerous. Now, we've been hoping for the pace of mechanization in South Africa to pick up, but it hasn't yet. Again, it has to, of course, to do with money. Money must make economical sense to do it, and platinum miners haven't had the funds.
Right. And I could also just say a word about that. I've been involved with efforts to try and look at changes, the gender shift in our workforces, and I do believe that that gold and platinum mining present particular problems. The drillers on both in gold and platinum are regarded as there's a very macho culture attached to it, and they are really seen as king of the castles. They are the strong men with a great deal of endurance. So even in their peer group, they are regarded as being legendary. And you can imagine how one tries to shift a situation like that. It cannot be done simply by cultural changes. It will come through changes in the tools for mining.
Firestone, Copperstone Resources. Technical question to both of you. Do you see this technology that you're developing for these narrow reefs, for precious metals mainly, transferring into base metals, for example, high-grade copper, high-grade zinc, lead deposits as well? Or is this something that we see exclusively being carried out in precious metals?
Wherever you have a narrow reef ore body and the economics make sense, it makes sense to use that equipment.
I would agree with that, which is why I think it's important for us to make a much larger case than simply the South African case. Also, as you know, with many of the ore bodies that you've mentioned, the chemical methods that are associated with them are particularly injurious to the environment and particularly injurious to water. So, you know, an alternative that is more environmentally friendly would make sense as well.
Have you seen any examples yet?
No. It has. That's why the innovation has to take place where there's a big case to make it, and we have to make the change at home.
Okay, Lars Rudekar, I'm the sales director for OF Engineering. Question to me: how can the entry be made sort of more easier for suppliers from Sweden into the South African market?
I think there is an opportunity at the moment to join the discussions that we're having on the way forward. And if I could just refer to the work that's being done post this big national conversation, we're talking about implementation. The CSR is hosting what we call a mining hub, and that is at the site that Magnus referred to earlier, where we had large scientific work being done around the mining sector as a whole. But at that hub, we are now looking at mining companies, equipment suppliers, and others being our professional associations, as well as some research being based in that hub. At the moment, the discussions are largely with our local suppliers around how we increase their share and their activity within the mining market. But it's very clear that we need to partner with international OEMs. You're far ahead of us in terms of the level of development and the level of automation that you've achieved, and we're needing to find a way of linking some of the local discussions with that. So, I'm very happy to go back with that message that we're needing to find ways of bringing the international OEMs into that discussion.
We have a strike, as you know, and one of the participants sent me an email here. He's a doyen of the mining sector, Bosse Hedberg. He was in South Africa, he writes here in his email, in the mid-'80s, trying to reorganize and introduce mechanical methods, and it failed because of the employment situation. And when I listen to both of you, and particularly you, May, I think the employment situation will still be a very strong hurdle, even if you develop together with Sandvik all the necessary equipment. So the situation of having to make people leave the industry in large numbers will be very difficult. How can you deal with that? Because I think that's really where the big problem lies, to have the mechanization accepted.
That's true, and it is a very difficult discussion. At the moment, if all of the trade unions in the country, including the mining unions, are particularly concerned about employment levels. So any talk of job cuts, and that they've come in the mining industry on the back of the economic conditions, I'm sure that Henrik is aware of that. We had 35,000 jobs lost in the mining sector just last year because of the economics. So, and I think it's the key to having this discussion is about talking about the economics now and the economics going forward, and the important aspect of developing other industries ranged around mining supply, and far more sophisticated ones. So I don't think the conversation is by any means settled, but there is significant understanding of the fact that we have no choice but to change, because the industry, as it stands, is not viable with the type of mining that we do.
Looking at your graph of the platinum group mines, I mean, that's quite obvious. So if you could put your methodology, Henrik, how much further out would you be able to push that? You can't answer in detail, but
Well, you can if you look, at least if you think history is a good predictor of the future. If you look at the mines that were operating in copper in 1955, they're still at about 90 to 95% of their capacity that they were at. So you tend to be able to extend the life of mines well beyond it. So the graphs will always look like that, because you haven't explored and you don't know what's in the ground. And
True.
When you get closer to the closer of a mine, you find new mineral and new ore bodies, and you can extend it, provided the economics work. But currently, especially in platinum, and I think maybe this is how the mechanization will happen, is currently the economics are closing the mines down, and employment is then being reduced. So rather than you have a new mechanized mining method replacing or forcing the unemployment, the economics is doing it for us, unfortunately. And I think we will come back and mechanize these mines and extract the ore bodies over time. It's a question how quickly we can get there. I think what tends to happen when economic activity in one area gets replaced by another, and you get a lot of people that are freed up for employment, as long as you generate GDP in that area, there will be other employment, and it will be so in a mining area. If 10,000 people are put out of work, replaced by mechanized methodology, it's a high likelihood that they will find work because of the GDP that the mine keeps generating, and fuels that local community.
I think for me it's the transition that is really, really difficult, because it requires a great deal of investment to mechanize these mines, as you're well aware. And the problem with the idea that mines will close, are closing because of employment and then they might reopen in the future, is that you don't necessarily have the mining houses with the big capital to back that investment in place when it does become economically viable. And that really is one of the challenges around organizing the economics of the sector. We need to make sure that there's enough interest in gold and platinum mining by the mining majors to make this transition work. It cannot be done with junior companies. It certainly requires another level of investment.
Well, that's another area which I find interesting, the triple B, double E part of the mining sector. Do they have the investment capacity to take their 23 or 25% of the industry forward?
Well, I think I'm very glad that you talked about triple B and double E as opposed to BEE, because I think there is at the moment a discussion about what it's going to take to ensure that we both have inclusive growth of the mining sector as well as longevity in the mining sector. And clearly simply just a transfer of ownership where companies take shares in the mines that doesn't result in changes to mining methodology and doesn't spread the benefit further than beyond a handful of individuals is a model at the moment that's come under a huge deal of criticism and pressure. And the jury's still out as to how that debate will be resolved. But if one talks about BEE, it's about looking at, for example, one could look at this transition from the perspective of the opportunities don't only lie in the extraction and mining process itself, but it lies in the mining value chain. And how do we realize value out of that value chain for all in South Africa, and what mechanisms are needed for that?
So, but if we look back towards 1994, it's already 20 years, have the BEE partners contributed their part of the investment, or is part of the explanation why investments has gone down is that simply the new owners don't have enough funds to bring the industry forward?
I think there's a general problem in South Africa in terms of getting investment into the sector, and it's been around policy uncertainty. But if one looks outside of gold and platinum mining, where you don't have the similar sort of crises, one certainly sees a lot more productive and active BEE companies. And if you look at iron ore, if you look at coal, for example, there have been huge success stories there. I think the economics of gold and platinum is a very different kettle of fish.
Okay. Some input, yes, over there.
Market for raw materials group, and for example, this extra low profile equipment that is in use in some mines. I know that Lonmin use those XLPs, but I don't know how it is today. Are they still working, or?
Yeah, they're still operational, and we're developing more equipment. We're actually releasing an extra low profile dozer for there's something called a Mine Expo, which is the biggest mining show every 4 years, and we'll launch that product there, which allows you to then remotely operate about a 1 meter high dozer underground, so you can stand where it's 2 meters high, and the dozer goes in and pushes the dirt, and you can then mine sections remotely operated, and so you don't have to crawl in there and get the rocks out.
Yeah, because I got the impression that it was like very. It has not become a more standard. It's very
That's absolutely true, because it takes it then. So if to go from conventional to mechanized with that type of equipment, you have to invest a lot in the equipment. You have to train operators, and then you have to let maybe 80% of your operators go. And that's a big transformation for a mine to take on and get through and work through with the unions and so on. It's been proven quite difficult to make that happen.
I think also that extra low profile equipment have largely been used in new sections of mines that have opened. So, one really can't look at it as a major transformation of existing mining activity. But also, as you are aware, there are some problems with it. And I'm familiar, I was in the Chief Inspector of Mines role at the time when that equipment was introduced on the mines, and the difficulty of having people lying on their backs operating equipment is extremely problematic. So, so it goes back to the question of how mechanized, what kind of automation one requires.
There is room for a few more questions before we have to end. Yes, Lars-Erik?
Talking about mechanization, automation, and introducing digitalization in mining. How is the sort of digitalization from other sort of areas transferring experiences and technology into mining? I think there is still very big rooms for improvement.
I couldn't agree with you more. That there's the crossover from other industries into mining provides some really food for completely different and innovative thinking. If I refer back to the organization from which I am from, I think within that organization there's enormous capacity to facilitate that kind of change. But and we see that in pockets of industry that those changes are happening. Clearly, in the automobile sector, that's the way that manufacturing is going. But it poses then the larger questions of what does the future of our economy look like? What does employment look like for South Africans? But at the same time, within the context of mining and the shifts that need to happen now, we have people in the CSR itself who work on issues of digitization, work on sensors, work on automation, work in the aerospace industry and other industries who could bring their expertise to bear. And so I think some of these things will be happening in parallel.
Yes. Just a comment. I really, together with Sandvik, my former company, LKAB, we introduced self-driving machines. That's 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think there has been more or less a standstill in R&D in mining the last 10 years.
That's right.
There is so very much more to do.
Mm-hmm.
That might very well have been driven by the necessity to improve productivity during low price periods. So if that is the case, we are in for a better situation now where the pressure is increasing.
I agree.
Yeah, okay. The final one, Deborah.
Oh, okay. A question to May. I was quite interested in this idea around the tension around land use. I understand that there's now a push to have increased agricultural use again in terms of poverty alleviation and food security. So I'm just wondering how you think those pressures are going to come together going forward, this push to have people back on the land, increase agricultural use versus use for mining. What do you see happening?
Certainly I think the idea that people will go back to the land is not one that we're likely to see ever take off. I mean, as you know, the pressures for urbanization are really the pressures that we face. Is how does a city like Joburg that is growing at extraordinary rates deal with the fact that it's ever expanding? So in much the same way that we're talking about transitions in mining, we are talking about food security, I think, in a different way. The efforts that are being made to make land productive is particular, and I think that's really what it is. When you say getting people back to the land, is about how do you make land productive? How does the small plots that people farm in the rural areas, how do they become productive enough to actually have surpluses and generate some money and create more of a cash economy in those areas. So, you know, there is all moving parts and quite complex, but I don't think that we, like any other country, are going to reverse the trend of urbanization.
May I ask more a summary question? Because I guess a lot of the Swedish both institutes and companies are interested when this mechanization of the mining industry will happen, which I understand also happen to a much larger extent within the coal sector. So you have also different benchmarks within South Africa. When do you think it's going to happen? Henrik, you said when it makes economic sense, but do you know, could you make a time estimate?
If I can say, it's actually starting right now. So the movement into this mining hub has meant that the Department of Trade and Industry, the Department of Science and Technology, and the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation in our presidency have made money available to set up the hub. From there, the different work streams will develop, and we have commitments from all of those departments, including Treasury, to look at how we fund an R&D drive that has central to it a discussion with the industry and equipment suppliers on where we need to go. So it's a case of making sure that this hub takes off, that it's effective in producing the kind of outcomes that we need that allow for particular work streams to take place. And on the side, we have then Treasury, DTI, and DST working together on how we fund this. So the window is, the intention is to look at making sure that there's reliable funding for at least a decade. But as I say, we only have funding for year one, and at the moment, the challenge for us is to get the sensible ideas out there so that they're workable.
Yeah, Henrik.
Maybe I'll add a little bit of nuance to the answer. Mechanization in South Africa has been ongoing largely for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Right. At a rate about 1 to 2% per year. So 1 to 2% more volumes come out of mechanized instead of conventional mining. We want to see that grow to 8 to 10% per year. If the growth is 8 to 10% per year, this is a super exciting market for Sandvik to invest in. If it continues at 1 to 2% per year, it will still be an important market for us, but it doesn't get the same attention and pull for resources.
Oh, that's a very important stat for me to have in my mind as well.
Thank you very much, May. Thank you, Henrik. And thank you, listeners, for participating.
Thanks. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks very much.
You collaborate a lot with